It's in 1860 that the Republicans finally will get elected to the presidency, and in which the debate over the rule of slavery in the Constitution, is once and for all addressed. Lincoln gets the Republican nomination in 1860 for a couple of reasons. First, the sense is that he is more moderate than William Seward, and the Republicans, still are perceived as the minority party here, and so the sense is they want a more electable candidate. And second, many of the swing states in 1860 were in the Midwest: Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. And the belief is that Lincoln as a Midwesterner will be stronger there than Seward as a Northeasterner. Lincoln chooses as his running mate Hannibal Hamlin, a Republican senator from Maine. So it's a kind of regional balance. The Republicans are not even on the ballot in most states of the South. So the question is, can they win enough votes in the Electoral College just in the northern states? The Democratic Party divides in 1860. They cannot agree on a candidate. So the regular Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's opponent, from the 1858 Senate race in Illinois, as their candidate. But the Southern Democrats, for the only time in the history of the party, nominate a separate presidential candidate, John Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president and is a strong defender of slavery and slave states' rights in American politics. And then there is a fourth party called the Constitutional Union Party, whose presidential candidate is John Bell. And most of the Constitutional Unionists, their sole party platform is retaining the Union, keeping the Union together at all costs. These were mostly Southern Whigs, so they're people who don't like the Republicans because they see the Republicans as too radical on slavery, but who also have been longtime opponents of Southern Democrats. And so they organize their own party. This is a party which will not last. And so 1860 is the only year in which it runs a presidential candidate. And the result is this map, where the Republicans basically sweep the northern states in red. Stephen Douglas wins, only one state of Missouri, actually loses his home state of Illinois. The Constitutional Union Party wins a handful of border states, and then the Deep South states go to the Southern Democrats. So the result is that even though in the popular vote Lincoln is the winner, but only with 40%, in the Electoral College he is the overwhelming winner. And really what occurs, this is a county by county map of the 1860 presidential campaign, is that there are two presidential elections in 1860. So there's one election in the north. The Republican Party is red on this map. The Democratic Party is blue on this map. So basically in most of these northern states, it's just Republican against Democrat. And then in the southern states, the Southern Democratic Party is green on this map. The Constitutional Union Party is yellow on this map. And these it's basically Constitutional Union against Southern Democrats in the North. So politically, the country had divided between a North and a South, by the time 1860 presidential candidates were nominated. There is a last-ditch effort to keep the country together through a series of proposed constitutional amendments offered by John Crittenden, and we read a few of these for today. Crittenden was a Whig senator from Kentucky, the last of the Whig senators, someone who saw Henry Clay as his sort of political hero and wanted to try to take Clay's approach of finding a compromise to avoid the Union collapsing. And the Crittenden amendments, which were proposed as a series of amendments to the Constitution, basically tried to get rid of popular sovereignty. So they said, look, he's saying to the Northerners, we understand that the Stephen Douglas Kansas-Nebraska Act was bad. We're going to restore the Missouri Compromise line and extend it to the Pacific. In this respect, there'll be no slavery in states that are admitted north of the Missouri Compromise line. But before the state becomes a territory, Congress won't have the power to abolish slavery in territories. And critically, and no other amendment had such a provision, that this would be unamendable. There would be no way ever to eliminate slavery through a constitutional amendment. Some Southerners are willing to talk to Crittenden, although the movement for secession has become very strong. Lincoln engages in kind of desultory negotiations, but makes clear in the end that he's not interested in what Crittenden has on offer. And these proposed amendments never even get voted on in Congress, and they really are the last constitutional attempt to keep the country together before secession. The result is that the southern states secede in a couple of waves. The first, the states that are in dark red here, secede before Lincoln takes office as president. And you can see in South Carolina, there's basically near unanimous support for secession. But in a lot of the other southern states, especially in these kind of northern areas or areas where there are lots of poor whites, areas where the Southern Whig Party once had been strong, opposition to secession remains in 1861, but it's always voted down. After Lincoln becomes president, 4 other southern states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, secede. But there will be a handful of border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, which secedes from Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, in which slavery is legal, but they remain as part of the Union throughout the Civil War. Although in both Missouri and Kentucky, there's a lot, and Maryland actually, there's a lot of fighting at various points in the war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery interests. The war has begun before Lincoln takes office. This is a bombing of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. President Buchanan's position is that the secession of states from the Union is a violation of the Constitution. It's an unconstitutional act. But, he says, the Constitution also doesn't give him, as president, the authority to use force to keep the Union together. And so basically the federal government remains impotent between Election Day 1860 and when Lincoln will take office in early March of 1861. Lincoln finally gets in and is immediately faced with a constitutional crisis. Organized around the location of the capital. So here's Washington, D.C. Here's a map of the railroad system in the United States as it existed in 1860. And so if you look closely here, what you'll notice is that to get to Washington, D.C. by rail, you either have to come from the Confederate States or you have to come through Baltimore. Obviously, there's going to be no supplies coming in to D.C. through the Confederate States, but Baltimore is a problem. Maryland is a slave state; it has remained loyal to the Union, but there's a really strong secessionist impulse in pro-Confederate impulse in Baltimore, and there's a fear that if pro-slave interests take over Baltimore, that will cut off Washington, D.C. from both sides. So this is a closer vision of this map. So here's Washington, D.C. Here are the railroads from the south, which are now under Confederate control, and then all the railroads from the northeast or from the far west that go to D.C. pass through Baltimore. And if you have ever taken the train from New York to D.C., this is still the train route between the two cities. You have to pass through Baltimore. So as a result of a fear that pro-slavery insurrectionists might take over Baltimore, Lincoln issues a military order telling the commander general of the army in Maryland that he has the authority to safeguard the railroad and to arrest and hold. That's what suspending the writ of habeas corpus means. So the military could arrest someone, but would not have to present them with charges, would not have to try them, would simply be allowed to indefinitely detain them. Any insurrectionist who's attempting to undermine the Union cause. And one such insurrectionist is this guy, John Merriman, who was arrested by the military. He was acting on behalf of the Confederates. He's put in a military brig, and his lawyer then goes to court and demands habeas corpus, so a court order that would require him to be released and to force the government to bring regular charges against him. This case goes before Chief Justice Taney. Taney is not functioning in this case as the Chief Justice of the United States. Instead, he is functioning as an appeals court judge in Maryland. For much of the 19th century, because the Supreme Court didn't there weren't a ton of cases before the court, justices would simultaneously be on the Supreme Court, but would be divided around, go around the country as an appellate court judge as well. Obviously, we don't have this system anymore. And it was the custom that the Chief Justice would always be would have responsibility for the circuit in Maryland, so he wouldn't have to travel as far from DC. And Taney issues an opinion called Ex parte Merriman, which basically says Lincoln does not have the authority to suspend a habeas corpus, again, to allow the military to arrest suspected insurrectionists in Baltimore. And the key passage from this opinion, the quite famous passage, the government of the United States is one of delegated and limited powers. It derives its existence and authority altogether from the Constitution, and neither of its branches, executive, legislative, or judicial, can exercise any of the powers of government beyond those specified and granted. And Taney says there's nothing in the Constitution that gives to the president authority to suspend habeas corpus. Congress can do so, but the president cannot. Lincoln's response to this order is to tell his generals, ignore it. He says that releasing Merriman and people like Merriman will simply be too dangerous, and he does. And he calls Congress back for a special session. He asks Congress to give him authority to suspend habeas corpus, and Congress votes for it. And in this famous message that he uses to invite them, he's essentially responding constitutionally to Taney. Taney is saying you don't have the constitutional authority to do this. Lincoln's response is to state the question more directly: are all the laws but one to go unexecuted? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people or too weak to maintain its own existence? So, what Lincoln is saying here is, look, yes, in theory, it's a bad idea if a government has the authority to put someone in indefinite military detention. That would be a government that is too strong for the liberties of its own people. But by the same token, what Taney seems to be envisioning is a government that simply can't protect itself from insurrection. It would be too weak to maintain its own existence. Washington, D.C., Lincoln feared would collapse. So, we looked in the past at Andrew Jackson, ignoring court decision in the Cherokee case. This is Lincoln kind of ignoring a court decision. Well, not kind of, Lincoln ignoring a court decision in Merriman. He does go back to Congress and request this authority. But it's a reminder that in times of peril, the power of the judiciary can be somewhat limited. So our final snippet is going to look at some of the changes in governmental structure during the Civil War itself.